Greetings! This is Griff Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, now with the 9th story of Isaac Asimov to see print in a science fiction magazine. This time it is his first story to appear on the pages of Super Science Stories, although once again his name is not on the cover, but at least it is in the table of contents. This magazine, as well as Astonishing Stories, was put out by his friend Fred Pohl, who tried to be his agent for a while, tried to play some of these early stories, couldn't, and then found that he could do something even better, was just actually publish them as his editor. So, the main editor he had for these two magazines, besides Campbell, that he had for Astounding Science Fiction. So it gave him some place to go for this. And it is right here in the table of contents. You see it? The story was called Strange Playfellow by Isaac Asimov, page 67. The little squib reads here, Robbie was only a machine, but he was Gloria's only friend. Now, let's just briefly discuss that title. As we know, Isaac didn't like that title at all, and he basically swore that every other place that story would ever appear, it would appear with the name he intended for it, which was simply Robbie. But Fred Pohl, on this occasion, for whatever reason, thought Strange Playfellow would make a better title. He does that. At any rate, I think what it was is, if it had been a standalone story, I don't think there'd be an objection to say it's Strange Playfellow, because, I mean, here's this high-tech, robotic creature that's existing just to be the nursemaid of a little girl, playmate. That would be kind of a strange playfellow, certainly by 1939 or 40 standards, 39 when he wrote it, 40 when he actually saw it in print. But what I think Fred Pohl didn't understand was that this was only the first of a very important series of his stories that would come together as one of his other books, the second published book after Pebble in the Sky, known as I, Robot. So here's the Doubleday edition of it. Okay, I, Robot. Let's see here. Okay. Anyway, I, Robot. So, I, Robot, of course, that's a whole another set of stories, which I really haven't delved much into. Now, as I go through these stories, I will be doing I, Robot, one story at a time. Perhaps at some point I'll review the whole book. After all, I've reviewed the Foundation books. Now, but let's take the individual stories. That's the theme of this series. So, in Strange Playfellow, the original version of it, the storyline is basically the same. There are some very significant differences. So far, up to this point, the differences between the way the stories originally appeared and the way they've appeared in usually the early Asimov, or in the one case of Marooned Off Vesta in Asimov's Mysteries, the stories are preserved pretty much almost exactly as they were originally printed, with just maybe a couple minor things, fixing some typos, or like Marooned Off Vesta, some numbers written as digits get turned into words, and things like that, just little itty-bitty stuff. But basically wanting to capture the full flavor and wording and everything right down to the pulpishness for historical purposes of the original story. Unfortunately, Strange Playfellow /Robbie is not in that category. When it got gathered up as a group of stories, and in fact this is the earliest story to be gathered up into a book of his short stories, that short story was the I, Robot collection, and all the others are in Astounding Science Fiction. This one is unique. All the Foundation installments were in Astounding Science Fiction, not counting the recent ones in Isaac Asimov's Science Fiction magazine. But all the robot stories that went into I, Robot were, except one, this one, were in Astounding Science Fiction. This one, John Campbell did not take he had some reasons that he objected to it. And one thing that impressed Isaac Asimov about Fred Pohl was that Fred was able to anticipate what John Campbell's reasons would be for rejecting the story. So, unfortunately, he doesn't list what those reasons were. Beyond possibly, it was kind of similar to at least a couple other stories. There was one called Helen Olay that had been published in Astounding Science Fiction not long before this. There was also another one published in Amazing maybe just a month or two before his Marooned Off Vesta by Ian Doe Bender that was actually titled I, Robot. And both of those stories featured robots as sympathetic characters, so even that wasn't totally unique or original with Isaac Asimov. However, those stories are known now to real serious science fiction aficionados who dig that stuff out and like to chase it down. Most people don't. I don't know how big the readership of Ian Doe Bender is. I don't imagine that they're much read anymore. And even Asimov is probably only read because he promoted himself so very well. So, anyway, it said Strange Playfellow, and as an isolated story, that would have been a reasonable title. As part of the Robot series, it should have been named Robbie, so I understand the conflict there. Now, the other thing we would lose, of course, that we always lose, would be the artwork that comes with the story. And we have such artwork here on the original page of Strange Playfellow. And as you can see, there's again a little publishing blurb, and it's by Isaac Asimov. You can see here's the robot looking like he's just let go, and here's this, it's supposed to be a little girl. I don't know, kind of looks more like a 50s housewife with a banana around her head, but Rosie the Riveter maybe even. Well, Rosie the Riveter hasn't come along yet, so okay. But at any rate, this is supposed to be little Gloria falling in the tall grass, because as the robot explains, or as the story explains, let's see if I can find this. I want to find this. Jeez. All right. Okay, she's riding the robot. She goes, faster, Robbie, faster. And the robot increases speed until the vibration forced Gloria's happy laughter out in convulsive jerks. Clear across the field he sped to the patch of tall grass on the other side, where he stopped with a suddenness that evoked a shriek from his flushed rider and tumbled her onto the soft, natural carpet. So we have portrayed that particular instant as the story. They're having fun. You can see the little girl has got a big smile. She's having a grand old time with this robot plaything of hers. But as we know, the story here, in trying to put this together in the cohesive account of I, Robot, the changes are, in this case, quite substantial, actually. Although the bare bones of the story are all still there, or mostly there, a few small details were deleted in favor of much larger details. Most notable, that right before that jumping into the soft grass, she's riding on him, like a child on somebody's, neck or something, kind of piggyback, and the robot's running around, and there he's just running faster or whatever. When it got expanded, suddenly she's now pretending he's an air coaster. Put your wings out, and like this, you can't be an air coaster if you don't have your arms out like wings, and we're flying this way and that, and then suddenly she's a space projectile and a spaceship, and then she's zapping the pirates and all this kind of imaginary, child playhood thing that wasn't in the original. So it kind of fleshed stuff out a little bit there. Another particularly noticeable bit of fleshing was the part where her mother is really complaining about this thing. She doesn't trust it, and then she brings in this. She's trying to wear down her father, who brought this thing in, and talk him into sending it back. I don't trust this machine, and she's all, I don't trust it. I think something could break, and da-da-da. And she even does something that's not in the original. She brings in, what will the neighbors think? The neighbors are getting worried about having this monster in their midst. And it's like, oh well. Anyway, that was kind of one of the worries. The biggest change, however, is the one, well, she goes in to see the talking robot. Now, in the original scene, I'll read a couple short extracts of that to see how they read here. Okay. She wanted to see the talking robot. So, let's see here. The talking robot, as a scientific achievement, left much to be desired. It sprawled its unwieldy mass of wires and coils through 25 square yards, and every robotical function had been subordinated to vital attribute of speech. It worked, and was in this respect quite a victory. But as yet it could translate only the simpler and more concrete thoughts into words. Certainly it was not half so clever as Robbie in Gloria's opinion, and with all the latter's speechlessness, it probably wasn't. Gloria watched it silently for a while, waiting for the 2 or 3 who watched with her to depart. Then, when she stood there alone for the moment, she asked hurriedly, "Have you seen Robbie, Mr. Robot, sir?" Now, I'm going to continue on another little discussion here that's more or less mostly the same between the two. So finally this robot's going, "A robot like me?" That's a concept this talking robot does not get in both versions. But the talking robot's only response to this was an erratic splutter and occasional incoherent sound. The conception of other robots like him had stalled his thinking engine, for he had not the mental complexity to grasp the conception. Gloria was still waiting, with carefully concealed impatience, for the machine's answer when she heard the cry behind her of, "There she is," and recognized that cry as her mother's. Now, that didn't sound too impressive. She saw the talking robot. There was a couple of people. She waited for them to clear out. She talked to the robot. She asked if Robbie knew what happened to the talking robot and who Robbie was. Well, let's see how this goes here. In the book, when it got gathered in here as part of the book, I have just trouble finding it. Okay. The talking robot was a tour de force, a thoroughly impractical device possessing publicity value only. Once an hour, an escorted group stood before it and asked questions of the robot engineer in charge in careful whispers. Those the engineer decided were suitable for the robot's circus were transmitted to the talking robot. It was rather dull. It may be nice to know that the square of 14 is 196, that the temperature at the moment is 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air pressure 30.02 inches of mercury, that the atomic weight of sodium is 23. But one really doesn't need a robot for that. One especially does not need an unwieldy, totally immobile mass of wires and coils spreading over 25 square yards. Few people bothered to return for a second helping, but one girl, in her middle teens, sat quietly on a bench, waiting for a third. She was the only one in the room when Gloria entered. Gloria did not look at her. To her, at the moment, another human being was but an inconsiderable item. She saved her attention for this large thing with the wheels. I think it means like the gears, not that it was on wheels and traveled around. Okay. For a moment, she hesitated in dismay. It didn't look like any robot she had ever seen. Curiously and doubtfully, she raised her troubled voice. "Please, Mr. Robot, sir, are you the talking robot, sir?" So it's a little more fleshing out before she gets, do you know where Robbie is? And I'll skip down to the equivalent place here, where again he's saying, "A robot like me?" "Yes, Mr. Robot, sir." To which the talking robot only response was an erratic splutter and an occasional incoherent sound. The radical generalization offered it, i.e., the existence not as a particular object but as a member of a general group, was too much for it. Loyally it tried to encompass the concept, and half a dozen coils burned out. Little warning signals were buzzing. The girl, in her mid-teens, left at that point. She had enough for her Physics 1 paper on practical aspects of robotics. This paper was Susan Calvin's first of many on that subject. Gloria stood waiting, with carefully concealed impatience, for the machine's answer when she heard the cry behind her of, "There she is," and recognized that cry as her mother's. So, big difference. Susan Calvin got injected into the story. She had not been in the story as original. So, that's an interesting thing. There's one other small thing, and that is that in the original, they go to New York City in 1982. For some reason, in moving it over to the gathering for the book, it was changed to New York City in 1998. So, anyway, those are a number of much more significant differences. Sadly, that story or version seems to have been released only in the original magazine and one other place. It's believed to have been, unfortunately, I've not been able to verify it. He had a series of these, the Great SF stories, and they're numbered and they go by years. This one's actually number 4. It covers some stories from 1942, which, by the way, includes the original version of his first Foundation story, as originally published. Again, minus the artwork and publisher blurbs, etc. But basically, the main text is all there the way it was originally, with the additional paragraphs in the front that would later be thrown away and replaced with the whole psychohistorian. But you go back a couple volumes to number 2, which sadly I don't have. That's supposed to have, well, I'm not sure whether they call it Strange Playfellow, because he swore he'd call it Robbie everywhere, or Robbie, but by whichever title, it is supposed to have the original text as originally contained. Again, minus artwork and publisher's blurbs, of course. So, unfortunately, I've not been able to verify that. But at any rate, that would be the only place besides the original magazine that the original version of the story is available. So, that said, it's a fairly straightforward story. It's a sympathetic one, of course. Basically, the robot cares about the little girl. Her father works for the robot-making company and understands a lot about its inner workings and just how safe it is. There's some minor insertions that kind of imply, without stating them straight out, the 3 laws. I mean, there's explicit reference to some of them in general concept without saying the first law is this and so forth. So, but again, the 3 laws were a thing when you gathered this up, and it subtly kind of acknowledges that without actually introducing them in the revised version. And the original is just kind of, these things are built to be safe or something general like that. I'd have to look it up. But at any rate, so it's a neat trick. They go to the place where the robots are made, and that's where her father is arranged. This is a little rivalry between her parents. Mother, for some reason, doesn't like this thing in the house, and father, he knows what it is. He thinks it's a great thing for his little girl. It's keeping her company, and she sees just how miserable she is without it, and so he wants to find some way to sell having it back in the house to a mother who just says like, "Oh, I don't trust this thing. I think it'll go crazy. Something will break loose and it'll go berserk on us." And a typical, robot destroys its creator story, which was, except for that, Helen Olay and I, Robot by Ian Dovinder, had been the universal robot story. Guy builds robot, robot destroys it. So, or and clank clank, and there are things man was not meant to know, and all this kind of stuff, So, I mean, this was a real advance, a very real and substantial advance. He wasn't first in it, but but he probably, I can't speak for the other stories, I haven't read them, but I know he did very well here, maybe as good or better than the others, maybe not, I don't know. Anyway, so it all ends with this rather clever thing where basically her father finds a way that the robot is seen. She goes after the robot. She gets endangered by this, and the robot is the thing that saves her life. You could say first law, though it didn't mention that by name. It didn't say, since the first law is that it will not harm a human being, nor through inaction allow a human being to be harmed. It doesn't say that, but it does indicate that the strongest thing, something to the effect that the strongest drive within it to see to it that no human being is harmed. And the robot thereby is what saves her life when she's running through all this machinery and whatnot that is between where she and her parents and some guy bringing them around the factory are, and where she sees Robbie, just Robbie, she runs out there without seeing anything else. So it's a great scheme. It's a cute little story, and it was a good introduction to robots, and as such, even though it didn't get on the pages of Astounding Science Fiction, it was a great introduction to the robot series, and as such, that would go on to be a series, which as we come up to those stories, we will discuss each of the individual stories as they come along. Well, I think that's what I have to say for this 9th published story by Isaac Asimov. Thanks for listening.